Imagine standing in the grand throne room of an ancient empire, where the air hums with tension and the flicker of torchlight dances across gold-laden tables. Before you, a king leans forward, not to declare war, but to negotiate, because in this moment, his entire kingdom rests on the value of a single object, a whispered secret, or perhaps the hand of a princess. This wasn't just fantasy, it was the reality of power in antiquity, where thrones could be won or lost not with swords, but with shrewd deals and unimaginable trades. Think about that for a second. Entire civilizations, built over centuries, their fates sealed not by armies clashing on battlefields, but by hushed conversations and the exchange of things we might overlook today. What could possibly be valuable enough to trade for a kingdom? The answer is as surprising as it is fascinating. From the sun-baked palaces of Egypt to the marble halls of Rome, rulers understood that true power wasn't just about territory or wealth, it was about leverage. A sacred relic could legitimize a dynasty. A marriage alliance could prevent a war. A hidden map or a spy's report could topple an empire without a single drop of blood spilled. These weren't just transactions, they were high-stakes gambles where the winners rewrote history and the losers vanished into obscurity. Consider Cleopatra, who traded her affection to secure Egypt's survival, or the Hittite kings who swapped vast stretches of land for fleeting peace. Every decision was a calculated risk, and the prizes at stake were nothing less than the destinies of nations. So why does this matter to us today? Because these ancient trades reveal a timeless truth. Power has always been fluid, shaped as much by diplomacy as by force. Over the next journey together, we'll uncover the 26 most astonishing things ever traded for kingdoms, from the glittering treasures that dazzled emperors to the intangible promises that held more weight than armies. You'll discover how a shipment of grain could topple a dynasty, why a hostage prince might become a kingmaker, and how a single piece of art could symbolize conquest without a battle. This isn't just history. It's a masterclass in strategy, ambition, and the art of the deal. So settle in, because we're about to peel back the layers of time to reveal how the ancient world turned negotiation into an empire-building superpower. To understand what could be traded for an entire kingdom, we must first step into the minds of ancient rulers, where value wasn't just about wealth, but about what kept you alive and in power. Picture a Mesopotamian king holding a clay tablet not just as a record, but as a sacred bond with the gods, or a pharaoh weighing the worth of a marriage alliance against the threat of invasion. In these worlds, a sack of gold might buy a mercenary army, but a prophecy from a trusted oracle that could buy a dynasty. Take the Hittites, for example. When they faced famine, they didn't just trade grain, they traded entire cities to their Egyptian rivals in exchange for survival. To them, land wasn't just territory, it was a bargaining chip to avert collapse. Meanwhile, in China, the Zhou dynasty didn't conquer through brute force alone. They mastered the art of granting titles and rituals to local lords, turning symbolic gestures into unshakable loyalty. These rulers knew that prestige could bind subjects tighter than chains. And then there were the intangibles, the things no merchant could price. The Spartans famously valued military prowess above all else, but even they couldn't resist the allure of Delphi's prophecies. When Croesus, the richest man in the ancient world, asked the oracle whether to attack Persia, her cryptic reply cost him his kingdom. Divine favor wasn't just superstition, it was a currency that could rally armies or doom rebellions before they began. But perhaps the most fascinating trade of all was knowledge. The Phoenicians guarded their shipbuilding techniques like state secrets, knowing their mastery of the seas depended on it. When Alexander the Great seized Tyre, he didn't just want their gold, he wanted their naval expertise, the kind that could turn a landlocked empire into a Mediterranean power. In an age without patents or copyrights, a single innovation could tip the scales of an entire civilization. This is why ancient trades still captivate us. They reveal a world where a polished stone could be worth more than a mine, where a hostage prince might become a kingmaker, and where the right whisper in the right ear could topple walls without a single battering ram. The stakes weren't just high, they were existential. And as we'll see, the rulers who understood this didn't just survive, they thrived by mastering the art of trading the invisible alongside the tangible. Land wasn't just dirt beneath their feet, it was lifeblood, security, and leverage all at once. In a world where maps were drawn in blood and ink, the right parcel of earth could mean the difference between an empire's rise and its ruin. Take the Hittites, for instance. When famine struck their heartland, they didn't hesitate to hand over chunks of territory to Egypt in exchange for shiploads of grain. On the surface, it might seem like desperation, but this was cold, calculated strategy. Those fertile valleys they surrendered, they were the price of survival, bought with land that could always be reclaimed later if they lived to fight another day. But not all land trades were born of crisis. Sometimes they were chess moves in a grander game. Rome mastered this art, swapping frontier provinces like playing cards to keep restless tribes at bay. A stretch of rocky highland given to a Germanic chieftain here, a strip of coastal marshland granted to a client king there. Each deal bought temporary peace, allowing legions to regroup or march elsewhere. What made these barren patches valuable wasn't their crops or gold, but their location. A single fort on a mountain pass could control trade routes for centuries, turning a wasteland into a throne's most prized possession. Then there were the deals that reshaped continents. The Treaty of Kaddish, etched into clay tablets over 3,000 years ago, didn't just end a war between Egypt and the Hittites, it redrew the Near East's political map. Pharaoh Ramses II didn't just trade land, he traded spheres of influence, carving buffer zones that kept rival armies at arm's length. These weren't simple property exchanges, they were blueprints for empire where every hill and river bend held strategic weight. Even the most seemingly insignificant plots could hide explosive value. When the Chinese Han Dynasty ceded the Hexi corridor to the Xiongnu nomads, they weren't just giving away desert, they were surrendering control of the Silk Road's eastern gate. That narrow strip of sand became a chokehold on commerce, proving that in antiquity, land wasn't just about what grew on it, but what passed through it. The brilliance of these ancient negotiators lay in their understanding that land's worth was never fixed. A swamp to one king was a naval base to another. A barren plateau might seem worthless until someone discovered its cliffs were impregnable. This fluidity of value turned every border into a bargaining table, where kingdoms could gamble their futures on the roll of a geographic dice. And as we'll see next, when land wasn't enough, rulers turned to something even more dazzling, the glittering allure of gold and treasure. Gold gleamed in the ancient world like nothing else, not just as wealth, but as a tangible claim to power. When King Croesus of Lydia minted the first pure gold coins, he wasn't just showing off his riches, he was inventing a new language of dominance. These coins, stamped with his royal insignia, spread his reputation as far as trade routes could carry them, turning metal into propaganda. But here's the twist: gold's real power lay not in its sparkle, but in its ability to create obligation. Take the ransom of Richard the Lionheart. Captured on his way home from the Crusades, his freedom cost England 150,000 silver marks, a sum so vast it required literal tons of silver and gold to pay. Yet what's fascinating isn't the price tag, but what followed. To raise the funds, England imposed crushing taxes, sparking rebellions that weakened the crown for decades. The gold bought Richard's release, but it also exposed a harsh truth. Treasure could empty a kingdom as easily as it could fill one. The Persian Empire understood this duality better than most. When Darius the Great needed to quiet rebellious factions, he didn't send armies, he sent chests of gold darics to their leaders. These weren't bribes, they were investments in loyalty, with each coin bearing the image of the king as a constant reminder of who held the purse strings. But even Persia's mountains of gold had limits. When Alexander the Great toppled their empire, he didn't just seize their treasury, he redistributed it to his own men, turning Persian wealth into Macedonian allegiance in a single stroke. This reveals gold's Achilles heel. Without a system to back it, it was just heavy, shiny metal. Then there were the spoils of war, where plunder became political theater. After Rome sacked Carthage, they paraded centuries of accumulated treasure through the streets, not just to celebrate victory, but to erase Carthage's very memory. Yet within generations, that same gold was funding Rome's civil wars, proving conquest could be a pyramid scheme where today's victor became tomorrow's target. The most intriguing trades, though, involved gold's symbolic weight. When Byzantine emperors gifted jeweled crosses to barbarian chiefs, they weren't buying friendship, they were trading divine legitimacy for earthly loyalty. A chieftain wearing a Christian reliquary became, in the eyes of his people, a ruler blessed by distant Constantinople. This alchemy turning metal into authority was gold's true magic. But for every success, there were cautionary tales. The Visigoths' infamous sack of Rome in 410 wasn't about destroying the city, it was about looting its gold to fund their own kingdom. Yet within years, that same treasure made them targets, fractured their alliances, and hastened their downfall. Gold could open doors, but it couldn't bar them against envy. In the end, the ancients learned what modern investors know: liquidity isn't stability. A kingdom built on gold alone was like a palace on sand glittering, but doomed to sink under its own weight. The real power lay in what that gold could set in motion. The alliances forged, the debts called in, the loyalties cemented. Because while gold could buy a throne, only wisdom could keep it. A royal wedding in Antiquity was never just a celebration, it was a silent declaration of war or peace, wrapped in ceremony and sealed with rings. Consider Cleopatra, history's most famous matchmaker of empires. Her union with Julius Caesar wasn't about romance, it was a lifeline for Egypt, teetering on the edge of Roman conquest. By bearing Caesar's son, she didn't just secure an alliance, she wove her dynasty into Rome's very fabric. But when Caesar fell, she pivoted without hesitation to Mark Antony, rewriting the Mediterranean's power map with each calculated embrace. These weren't marriages, they were mergers where personal affection mattered less than the armies and treasuries they brought to the table. The Habsburgs elevated this cold calculus to an art form. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," wasn't just a saying, it was their empire's blueprint. Through strategic weddings, they absorbed Hungary, Burgundy, and Spain into a dominion where the sun never set. A single marriage contract between Philip the Fair and Joanna of Castile handed them control of half of Europe without a single sword drawn. Yet this strategy had a fatal flaw. Intermarriage thickened their bloodline to the point of collapse. Charles II, their final Spanish heir, suffered such severe genetic defects from generations of cousin marriages that he couldn't even chew his own food. A grim reminder that dynasties built on weddings could crumble under their own carefully arranged weight. But not all marital gambles paid off. When the Saxon King Henry the Lion married Matilda, daughter of England's Henry II, he dreamed of a trans-channel alliance. Instead, he sparked jealousy among German princes that cost him his duchy. Likewise, the marriage of Byzantine Princess Theodora to the Ottoman Sultan Orhan was meant to bridge Christian and Muslim worlds until her own family used the union as pretext to invade. These were high-stakes games where love was irrelevant, and the fine print of dowries and succession clauses could ignite wars as easily as prevent them. The most tragic irony, sometimes the pawns in these games turned the tables. When the Visigothic Princess Galla Placidia was married off to the barbarian King Ataulf after Rome's sack, she was expected to be a trophy. Instead, she became his trusted advisor, softening his raids and negotiating peace until his own men murdered him for growing too Roman. Her story reveals the unpredictable human element behind these transactions. A hostage bride could become a queen, a peace treaty could unravel into vendetta, and a marriage bed could become the most dangerous battlefield of all. What made these unions so potent wasn't just the political alliances they created, but the symbols they projected. When Charlemagne wed the Lombard princess Desiderata, only to discard her months later, the message wasn't subtle. He'd absorbed her father's kingdom, and the marriage was merely the receipt. Likewise, when Henry VIII broke with Rome to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he wasn't just ending a marriage, he was severing England's ties to centuries of Catholic tradition. In these moments, weddings and divorces weren't personal, they were seismic shifts in the tectonic plates of power. Yet for all their ruthlessness, these marital machinations occasionally birthed something unexpected, lasting change. The marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella didn't just unite Spain, it funded Columbus's voyages, altering global history. The Norse king Olaf Tryggvason's forced conversion of Norway through his marriage to a Christian queen reshaped Scandinavia's spiritual landscape. Even failed unions left legacies. The annulment of Elena of Aquitaine's marriage to France's Louis VII didn't just send her into the arms of England's Henry II, it ignited a rivalry that would burn for 300 years. In the end, these royal weddings proved that in antiquity, the heart was never just a heart. It was a bargaining chip, a battlefield, and sometimes, against all odds, a catalyst for empires. A kingdom without allies was like a ship without sails in the ancient world. It might float, but it could never outrun the storm. Military alliances weren't just agreements scribbled on parchment. They were lifelines thrown between rulers who understood that survival often meant sharing power. Take the Numidian kings of North Africa who clung to Rome's coattails to fend off rival tribes. For a time, it worked splendidly. Rome's legions shielded them, and in return, Numidian cavalry became the hammer to Rome's anvil. But the moment Numidia's King Jugurtha overplayed his hand, Rome didn't just withdraw support, they turned his kingdom into a province, proving that protection could quickly become possession. Client states learned this brutal lesson again and again. The Armenian kingdom of Tigranes the Great thrived as Rome's buffer against Parthia until Rome decided buffers made better colonies. Similarly, the Germanic chieftain Arminius was raised in Rome as an ally, only to lead his people in the Teutoburg Forest massacre, where 3 legions were annihilated. These stories reveal the paradox of ancient alliances. The stronger your patron, the more perilous their embrace. Mercenaries added another layer of volatility. Carthage's reliance on hired swords backfired spectacularly during the Mercenary War, where the very troops paid to defend the city turned on it, sparking a revolt bloodier than any external invasion. Yet when Byzantium hired the Varangian Guard, Norse warriors sworn to the emperor, they created an elite force whose loyalty became legendary. The difference. Byzantium paid in gold and prestige, but also in something intangible: identity. The Varangians weren't just soldiers, they were woven into the empire's mythology. proving that the most durable alliances were those that fed the soul as well as the purse. Then there were the Federation's alliances of equals, at least in theory. The Delian League began as a noble pact to shield Greek city-states from Persia, but Athens' dominance soon turned partners into subjects. Tribute became tyranny, and the League's treasury, once pooled for mutual defense, funded Athenian monuments like the Parthenon. It was a cautionary tale. Collective security could curdle into empire by committee. Even the most lopsided alliances had their uses, though. When the Han dynasty married princesses to Xiong, new nomad chiefs, it wasn't just about kinship. It bought decades of peace along the Silk Road, proving that sometimes the cost of an army was cheaper than maintaining one. Yet when the Xiongnu demanded a royal heir as hostage, the Han drew the line. Their refusal sparked wars that stretched for generations, showing how thin the ice of diplomacy could be. The bitterest irony, some alliances doomed both sides. When Sparta allied with Persia to defeat Athens in the Peloponnesian War, they traded short-term victory for long-term obsolescence. Persia's gold broke Athens, but it also broke Sparta's warrior ethos, leaving both Greek powers too weakened to resist Philip of Macedon's rise. In the end, the greatest danger wasn't betrayal. It was the slow erosion of self-reliance, the quiet realization that you'd mortgaged your kingdom's future to survive its present. These ancient power plays remind us that military alliances were never just about shared enemies or pooled resources. They were high-stakes performances where today's savior could become tomorrow's conqueror, and where the price of protection was often the very sovereignty you sought to preserve. The rulers who thrived understood that the strongest alliance wasn't the one with the most soldiers, but the one that knew when to walk away. In a world without satellites or instant communication, knowledge wasn't just power, it was the difference between empire and oblivion. The Phoenicians understood this better than most. Their closely guarded navigation techniques, how to read the stars, navigate by currents, even the secret locations of safe harbors, were more valuable than any cargo. When Greek sailors begged for these secrets, the Phoenicians didn't just refuse. They spread terrifying myths of sea monsters beyond certain waters to protect their monopoly. This wasn't just superstition, it was economic warfare. Control over knowledge meant control over trade routes, and trade routes built kingdoms. The Library of Alexandria took this concept to its grandest extreme. More than a repository of scrolls, it was a weapon of soft power. Ptolemaic kings didn't just collect knowledge, they confiscated it, demanding every ship docking in Alexandria surrender its books for copying. Original texts often, mysteriously, stayed in the library while copies were returned. This wasn't theft, it was strategy. By amassing the known world's knowledge, Alexandria became the intellectual capital of antiquity, attracting scholars, inventors, and spies. A ruler who controlled the library didn't just have access to ideas, he decided who else could access them. But the most explosive secrets weren't always written down. Take the case of Greek fire, Byzantium's legendary weapon. Its exact formula, thought to involve petroleum, quicklime, and other volatile ingredients, was so closely guarded that even today, historians can only speculate. Emperors passed the secret orally to one heir, ensuring no written recipe could be captured. When enemies offered fortunes for it, Byzantine spies fed them false formulas, leading to disastrous experiments that burned would-be thieves alive. The lesson was clear: in the right hands, a single technological secret could hold entire armies at bay. Religious knowledge carried similar weight. The Oracle of Delphi didn't just predict the future, she shaped it. Croesus learned this the hard way when her ambiguous prophecy, "If you cross the Holys River, a great empire will fall," led him to attack Persia, only to realize too late that the doomed empire was his own. Rulers from Lydia to Rome consulted her not for truth but for legitimacy. A favorable prophecy could rally troops, while a damning one could spark rebellion. In this way, divine secrets became political currency, traded not in gold but in whispered words and staged miracles. Even maps were state secrets. The Chinese Han Dynasty's detailed charts of the western regions weren't just navigation aids, they were the keys to controlling the Silk Road. When a Han envoy was captured by the Xiongnu, he destroyed his maps rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Centuries later, the Portuguese guarded their nautical charts so fiercely that leaking one was punishable by death. These weren't mere documents, they were blueprints for empire, where a single line on parchment could reveal which lands were ripe for conquest. The darkest trades, though, involved human intelligence. The Persian eyes and ears of the king weren't just spies, they were bureaucrats, merchants, even slaves planted in rival courts. A well-placed whisper about grain shortages or troop movements could destabilize a kingdom before the first sword was drawn. Rome's frumentarii, originally grain collectors, became masters of covert operations, assassinating troublemakers and stealing secrets under diplomatic cover. Their work proved that in antiquity, information wasn't just collected, it was harvested, weaponized, and traded like any other commodity. What made these knowledge trades so potent was their unpredictability. A stolen map could lead to new conquests, but a fabricated one could lure armies into traps. A genuine prophecy might inspire troops, while a forged one could cripple morale. In this shadowy economy, truth mattered less than perception, and the rulers who thrived were those who understood that sometimes the most valuable thing you could trade wasn't a thing at all, it was an idea. In the ancient world, gods weren't just worshipped, they were political operatives, their influence traded as ruthlessly as gold or land. Take the Ark of the Covenant, the gilded chest said to hold the stone tablets of Moses' commandments. For the Israelites, it wasn't merely a sacred object, it was a divine endorsement of their kingship. When the Philistines captured it in battle, they didn't just seize a trophy, they believed they'd stolen Yahweh's very power. But the Ark brought them only plague and misfortune until they returned it, a stark lesson that some relics refused to be weaponized by the unworthy. The Oracle of Delphi played a similar role in Greek politics. City-states didn't just seek her prophecies, they funded lavish gifts to the temple, effectively buying favor with Apollo. When Athens faced Persian invasion, they didn't just consult the oracle, they strategically framed their question. Should we abandon our city? Her infamous reply, to trust wooden walls, was interpreted as divine approval for their naval strategy, turning a cryptic phrase into a rallying cry that saved Greece. This wasn't spirituality, it was divine public relations where ambiguity became a canvas for political ambition. Relics took on even darker value during the Crusades. After the sack of Constantinople in 1204, French knights didn't just loot gold, they stripped the city of bones, teeth, and splinters of the true cross, shipping them back to Europe as spiritual currency. A single saint's finger could elevate a cathedral's status, drawing pilgrims and their donations by the thousands. Venice's Basilica di San Marco still displays the stolen body of Saint Mark, a tangible reminder that holiness could be stolen, bought, and leveraged for earthly power. The sale of indulgences revealed the cold calculus behind these trades. When medieval popes offered forgiveness for sins in exchange for donations to build St. Peter's Basilica, they weren't just funding architecture, they were monetizing salvation itself. This practice sparked Luther's Reformation, proving that when faith becomes too transactional, even the devout revolt. Yet relics also served as diplomatic tools. Byzantine emperors gifted fragments of the true cross to foreign rulers, not as acts of piety, but as subtle reminders of their divine connections. When Charlemagne received such a gift, it wasn't just a holy artifact, it was a silent message that God favored his empire. Similarly, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II used his possession of Christ's crown of thorns to negotiate with rebellious cities, proving that a single sacred object could command more obedience than an army. The most ironic twist, some relics were outright forgeries. Medieval Europe teemed with multiple heads of John the Baptist and enough nails from the crucifixion to build a ship. Rulers knew these were likely fakes, but authenticity mattered less than perception if people believed the power was real. These sacred trades reveal a timeless truth. In the hands of the ambitious, even the divine could be commodified. Whether through prophecy, plunder, or pious fraud, ancient leaders understood that controlling faith meant controlling fate itself. And as we'll see next, sometimes the most valuable pawns in these games weren't objects at all. They were living, breathing hostages. Sending your firstborn son to live among enemies would be unthinkable today, but in antiquity, it was standard diplomatic protocol, a grim insurance policy against betrayal. These royal hostages weren't shackled in dungeons. They were paraded in gilded cages, raised as honored guests, while their every move carried the weight of kingdoms. Take young Tiberius Gracchus, handed over to Carthage as collateral for Rome's treaty after the First Punic War. Far from being a powerless prisoner, he used his years in Carthage to master their language and tactics, returning home with insights that would later shape Rome's agrarian reforms. This was the paradox of hostage-taking. It could forge future statesmen even as it bound their father's hands. Augustus, before he became Rome's first emperor, began his political education as a hostage in the court of Mark Antony's brother. Rather than languishing, he observed the intricacies of power plays and alliances, turning his captivity into a masterclass in realpolitik. Similarly, the Persian Empire raised the sons of conquered kings alongside their own princes, not just as leverage but to mold them into compliant vassals. Yet this strategy backfired spectacularly with Cyrus the Great, who was sent to Media as a boy only to return years later at the head of an army that toppled his former captors. The most sophisticated rulers treated hostages as investments. Byzantine emperors educated barbarian princes in Constantinople, baptizing them into Christianity and sending them home as pro-Byzantine rulers. The Goth leader Theodoric spent his youth as a hostage in Rome, absorbing classical culture before founding a kingdom that blended Roman law with Germanic tradition. These weren't just prisoners, they were cultural ambassadors, their loyalties forever divided between their birthright and their upbringing. But the system had brutal flaws. When the Macedonian king Philip II took the young Alexander of Epirus hostage, he didn't anticipate his own son, the future Alexander the Great, forming a bond with him that would later complicate their military campaigns. And when the Carthaginians executed the Roman hostages they held during the Second Punic War, they didn't just break protocol, they ignited a fury that fueled Rome's eventual destruction of Carthage. Perhaps the most tragic figures were the collateral damage princes like the Assyrian crown Prince Ashur-nadin-Shumi, handed over to Babylon as a goodwill gesture, only to be murdered when diplomacy soured. His death didn't just end a life, it erased years of delicate negotiations in an instant. These stories reveal the twisted brilliance of ancient hostage diplomacy. A prince in chains could be both a sword of Damocles and a bridge between cultures, his fate a constant negotiation. The rulers who thrived understood that the real power lay not in holding hostages, but in knowing when to release them, or when to let them go home to claim thrones of their own. A single trade route could transform a dusty outpost into the crossroads of empires if you controlled it. The Silk Road wasn't just a path for silk and spices. It was a geopolitical weapon wielded by kings who understood that commerce moved faster than armies. Take Palmyra, a desert oasis that became the Middle East's wealthiest city by charging caravans for water, protection, and passage. Its rulers didn't conquer with swords. They taxed every camel laden with Chinese silk or Roman glass, turning their kingdom into a toll booth for continents. But when Queen Zenobia overplayed her hand, declaring independence from Rome and seizing Egypt's grain routes, she learned the hard way. Trade empires lived and died by the tolerance of greater powers. Venice's rise was even more audacious. With no farmland to speak of, the city built an empire on salt, not as a seasoning, but as the medieval world's preservative, essential for feeding armies and cities. By monopolizing Adriatic salt pans and forcing merchants to buy exclusively from Venetian warehouses, the Doges turned a humble mineral into a financial engine that funded wars, art, and a navy that dominated the Mediterranean. Their secret: they didn't just sell salt, they weaponized supply chains, stockpiling harvests to create artificial shortages that could bankrupt rivals or bend kingdoms to their will. The spice trade revealed even darker calculations. When the Portuguese seized control of Indian Ocean choke points like Hormuz and Malacca, they didn't just tax pepper and cinnamon. They burned rival ships and gouged prices to destabilize Muslim sultanates whose economies relied on those very cargoes. Sultanates that had flourished for centuries crumbled not under cannon fire, but under the weight of manipulated markets. Yet these monopolies carried the seeds of their own destruction. Spain's insistence on funneling all New World silver through Seville strangled its economy with bureaucracy, while the Dutch East India Company's ruthless control of nutmeg led to such overproduction that the spice's value collapsed. The lesson was clear: in the scramble to control trade, the greatest risk wasn't competition, it was success itself. The most haunting trades, though, involved human cargo. The trans-Saharan slave routes turned Timbuktu into a glittering capital built on gold and suffering, while the Venetian-controlled sugar plantations of Cyprus showed how a luxury commodity could warp an entire society's morality. These networks didn't just move goods, they reshaped cultures, erasing old loyalties and inventing new hierarchies where profit trumped kinship. What made these commercial empires so formidable was their invisibility. Unlike borders drawn on maps, trade routes were fluid, their power measured in debts owed and favors called in. A king might surrender a port today to keep his spices flowing tomorrow, never realizing he'd traded not just territory, but his kingdom's very soul. And as we'll see next, some rulers discovered that the most valuable exports weren't goods at all, but ideas, art, and the seductive power of culture. A statue wasn't just marble or bronze, it was a captured soul, a tangible piece of a people's identity ripped from its homeland and paraded as proof of conquest. When Roman generals looted Greek cities, they weren't just filling their treasury, they were staging the ultimate humiliation. The bronzes of Corinth, the marbles of Athens, even the obelisks of Egypt weren't merely spoils, they were living propaganda, physical declarations that Rome didn't just defeat you, it absorbed your greatness. The message was clear: your gods, your heroes, your very cultural DNA now belonged to the victors. But the Romans weren't mere thieves, they were meticulous curators of their plunder. The temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus didn't just house Roman deities, it became a museum of subjugation, where looted Etruscan statues stood beside Carthaginian relics. This wasn't random display, it was psychological warfare, a visual narrative that Rome's empire wasn't built on destruction, but on selective inheritance. By positioning themselves as the heirs of older civilizations, they transformed looting into a perverse form of flattery. The Byzantines played a darker game with their sacred icons. When Emperor Leo III ordered the destruction of religious images during the iconoclasm crisis, it wasn't just theological debate, It was a power play to weaken monasteries hoarding wealth and influence. Centuries later, when Byzantine emperors gifted precious icons to barbarian chieftains, they weren't sharing faith, they were exporting spiritual authority, knowing these holy hostages would anchor distant tribes to Constantinople's orbit. A painted panel of the Virgin Mary could do what garrisons couldn't: convert enemies into devout clients. China's emperors wielded art with similar precision. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace, it was a carefully choreographed collection of tribute. When vassal kings presented jade carvings or calligraphy scrolls, they weren't just offering gifts, they were performing cultural submission. The Qianlong Emperor's infamous art catalogue wasn't vanity. It was a ledger of dominance, each entry proof that his empire's gravitational pull bent even the most distant cultures toward his court. Perhaps the most twisted art trade happened during the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople. Crusaders didn't just steal gold, they dismantled the city's soul. The 4 bronze horses now standing atop Venice's St. Mark's Basilica weren't merely looted statues, they were the living heartbeat of Byzantine ceremonial processions, their absence a gaping wound in the empire's rituals. Venice knew their true value wasn't in metal, but in the symbolism. By displaying these trophies, they claimed Byzantium's legacy as their own. Yet art could also be a weapon of the weak. When the Maori traded intricately carved greenstone high-tiki pendants to British colonists, they weren't just exchanging trinkets, they were forcing Europeans to acknowledge their spiritual values. Similarly, Native American tribes traded wampum belts not as currency, but as contractual records woven with sacred patterns. These objects carried meanings no conqueror could erase, proving that even in defeat, art could preserve what swords couldn't destroy. The true power of these cultural trades lay in their ambiguity. A stolen statue might be a trophy to the victor, but to the vanquished, it remained a silent rebel, waiting to be reclaimed. The Elgin marbles, the Benin bronzes, the Rosetta Stone, these weren't just artifacts caught in legal battles. They were frozen arguments about who gets to write history. And as long as they endure, the wars they represent never truly end. A crown without an army might seem worthless, but in the fractured realms of medieval Europe, a title could be the difference between ruling and ruin. The Holy Roman Emperors perfected this delicate alchemy, transforming hollow honors into ironclad authority. When Frederick Barbarossa granted the title of Duke of Austria to the troublesome House of Babenberg, he wasn't rewarding loyalty, he was buying it. That parchment scroll, heavy with imperial seals, turned warlords into vassals overnight, proving that legitimacy could be manufactured with the right words and wax. Yet no one wielded symbolic power like the medieval papacy. A single papal bull could turn a bandit like William the Conqueror into God's chosen ruler of England after Hastings. Conversely, when Pope Innocent III stripped King John of England of his title in 1209, it wasn't just spiritual censure, it invited every noble in Europe to consider John's throne up for grabs. The Church understood that in a world where kings claimed divine right, their blessing was the ultimate currency. Pretenders exploited this system with breathtaking audacity. Perkin Warbeck, a Flemish commoner, spent years impersonating one of the lost princes in the Tower, using nothing but charm and forged heraldry to convince multiple European courts he was England's rightful king. His power came not from armies, but from the willingness of foreign rulers to entertain his claim as leverage against Henry VII. Similarly, the false Dimitris of Russia proved that with enough theatrical flair and a convenient, miraculous survival story, even a peasant could briefly wear the Tsar's crown. The most brilliant title trades happened in plain sight. When the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I created the hollow title, Sebastocrator for his brother, it wasn't about shared power, it was about neutralizing a rival with ceremonial busywork. Centuries later, the Habsburgs would use the even grander but equally meaningless title, Archduke, to elevate themselves above other German nobles without sparking revolt. These were masterclasses in political theater, where the appearance of status satisfied ambitions more safely than actual territory. Eastern empires played the same game with subtle variations. The Chinese mandate of heaven wasn't just philosophy. It was a renewable lease on power, revocable if floods or famines suggested divine displeasure. Japanese shoguns let emperors keep their heavenly titles while holding real power themselves, proving that in the right hands, an empty crown could be the perfect distraction. What made these trades so potent was their reversibility. A title granted could be stripped away, as Henry VIII learned when the Pope revoked his Defender of the Faith honor after the Anglican split. Yet the right title at the right moment could also cement dynasties, like when the Ottoman Sultan awarded himself the Caliphate after conquering Cairo, instantly transforming from warlord to spiritual leader of the Muslim world. In the end, these exchanges reveal a timeless truth. Authority is always partly fiction, sustained by collective belief. Whether stamped on parchment, carved into seals, or whispered in coronation rites, legitimacy was and remains the most valuable thing never truly owned. Greek fire wasn't just a weapon. It was Byzantium's lifeline, a closely guarded marvel that kept enemies at bay for over 7 centuries. The formula, known only to a select few, could burn on water and stick to flesh, turning naval battles into nightmares for invaders. When Arab fleets besieged Constantinople, it wasn't swords or arrows that saved the city. It was this mysterious liquid spewed from bronze tubes, igniting ships and men alike. The emperors treated the secret like a crown jewel, passing it down through whispered instructions and compartmentalized production. Even the workers who mixed the ingredients knew only fragments of the recipe, ensuring no single betrayal could unravel their advantage. This wasn't just chemistry, it was geopolitical chess where one innovation could hold off entire empires. China's silk monopoly operated on similar principles. For thousands of years, the secret of sericulture, raising silkworms and unraveling their cocoons, was worth more than gold. Exporting live silkworms or mulberry seeds carried the death penalty, and border guards inspected travelers' luggage for smuggled eggs. The payoff was staggering. Rome paid its weight in silver for Chinese silk, draining its treasury to clothe elites in translucent luxury. Then, around 550 AD, 2 Nestorian monks allegedly smuggled silkworm eggs hidden in hollow bamboo canes to Byzantium. Within decades, Constantinople had its own silk industry, and China's stranglehold on the trade began to crumble. The lesson was clear. In Antiquity, a single technological leak could reshape economies as surely as any war. Agricultural breakthroughs carried similar weight. The Roman grain dole didn't just feed the masses. It relied on Egyptian irrigation techniques so advanced that Rome annexed Egypt partly to control them. When the Hittites mastered iron smelting around 1200 BC, they didn't just upgrade their weapons, they triggered the Bronze Age collapse as their cheaper, stronger tools made rivals' arsenals obsolete overnight. Knowledge this transformative wasn't just traded, it was stolen, smuggled, and occasionally lost to history, like Damascus steel, whose forging techniques vanished with the Crusades. Even seemingly mundane innovations held strategic value. The Roman concrete formula, which hardened underwater, let them build harbors that anchored their naval dominance. When the recipe was lost after Rome's fall, Europe wouldn't replicate its durability until the 19th century. Similarly, the Persian Qanat system, underground aqueducts that turned deserts into farmland, was so vital that conquerors preserved it rather than destroy it, recognizing that some technologies were worth more than pride. The most fascinating trades weren't always voluntary. After the Battle of Carrhae, when the Parthians captured 10,000 Roman legionaries, they didn't just enslave them, they relocated the prisoners to Margiana, forcing them to build fortifications using Roman engineering techniques. Those very walls later stopped invading nomads, proving that even defeated soldiers could be unwitting agents of technological transfer. Yet for every success story, there were cautionary tales. The Mongol conquest spread gunpowder westward, but when Europeans refined it into cannons, they turned those very weapons against Mongol descendants. Likewise, the Spanish conquistadors' steel armor and crossbows gave them an edge over the Aztecs until indigenous allies mastered their use and turned them against new oppressors. Technology was a double-edged sword, and the rulers who forgot that often found their own innovations used against them. What made these exchanges so pivotal was their unpredictability. A stolen map might lead to new lands, but a smuggled seed could starve an empire by undercutting its farmers. A hostage engineer might build you a siege engine or secretly sabotage it at the crucial moment. In the end, the ancient world's most valuable trades weren't always the ones glittering in treasure rooms, but the ones smoldering in workshops where a single spark of ingenuity could ignite kingdoms or burn them to the ground. To call slavery the dark foundation of ancient empires would be an understatement. It was the invisible scaffolding that held entire civilizations aloft. The Spartans didn't just conquer the Messenians, they turned them into helots, a slave class bound to the land, whose forced labor freed Spartan men to dedicate their lives to war. But this wasn't mere oppression, it was an economic calculation. Every Spartan hoplite drilling on the training grounds represented a dozen helots toiling in the fields, their sweat subsidizing Sparta's military machine. The helots even became a bizarre form of currency. When Sparta needed ships during the Peloponnesian War, they reportedly offered helots as payment to their allies, trading human lives for naval power. Egypt's pyramids stand as monuments to a different kind of calculation. Contrary to popular myth, they weren't built by slaves in chains, but by corvée laborers, peasants conscripted during the Nile's flooding season when farming was impossible. Yet this temporary servitude was just as binding, with workers paid in bread, beer, and the dubious honor of serving the god king. The Great Pyramid's construction required an estimated 20,000 laborers at a time, rotating in shifts across decades. To Pharaoh Khufu, these weren't individuals, they were units of labor as expendable as the limestone blocks they hauled. The Roman Empire took this commodification to industrial scales. After crushing Carthage, they enslaved 50,000 survivors in a single day, flooding markets so drastically that the Latin phrase Carthaginian peace came to mean total annihilation. Roman elites didn't just own slaves, they traded them like stocks, with prices fluctuating based on skills, origins, and even teeth quality. An educated Greek tutor might cost as much as a small farm, while a mine worker, expected to die within months, could be had for the price of a good donkey. Yet the most chilling trades happened far from auction blocks. The Han Dynasty's state-owned iron mines ran on convict labor, where prisoners, often peasants unable to pay taxes, worked in shifts so brutal they were effectively death sentences. The Kushite kings of Nubia sold war captives to Egypt not for gold, but for access to sacred sites, trading bodies for spiritual capital. And in the Americas, the Maya used enslaved prisoners not just for labor, but for ritual blood sport, their deaths serving as both entertainment and political theater. What makes these exchanges so unsettling is their bureaucratic efficiency. Assyrian clay tablets record slave shipments with the same clinical detail as grain stores, while Byzantine tax codes assigned monetary values to enslaved individuals based on age and health. This wasn't just cruelty, It was capitalism in its rawest form, where human suffering could be calculated, leveraged, and insured against, but the system's greatest irony. Its fragility. Spartans lived in constant fear of helot rebellions, turning their society into an armed camp. Rome's reliance on slave-grown grain left it vulnerable when Spartacus' revolt disrupted supplies. Even the mighty Egyptians faced strikes. The first recorded labor protest in history happened at Deir el-Medina, where tomb builders laid down tools over unpaid wages, proving that coercion had its limits. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The splendor of antiquity was built on backs bent by force. The Parthenon's marble gleamed because slaves quarried it. The Silk Road silks shimmered because unfree hands spun them. And while we may recoil at these practices today, their legacy lingers in questions about whose labor fuels our own societies and what price we're willing to ignore. A handshake in antiquity could be stronger than chains until the moment it wasn't. Promises between kings weren't just words, they were the glue holding fragile alliances together, backed by everything from divine oaths to exchanged hostages. Yet history is littered with the wreckage of broken vows where a single betrayal could rewrite maps. Take Hannibal's infamous pledge after Cannae. With Rome's army annihilated, he could have marched on the city itself. Instead, he offered surprisingly lenient terms. Rome would keep its independence but abandon certain territories. The Senate, humiliated but defiant, refused. What happened next reveals the brutal calculus of ancient trust. Hannibal, bound by his own honor as much as military reality, didn't press the advantage. His hesitation wasn't weakness, it was the unspoken rule that even victors needed their enemies to keep promises someday. Rome, meanwhile, showed no such scruples. Within years, they'd turn Carthage's momentary mercy into an excuse for total annihilation, proving that in geopolitics, the honorable side often ended up as ashes. Yet some leaders built empires on the opposite principle. Numidian King Massiniss's lifelong loyalty to Scipio Africanus wasn't just friendship, it was brilliant strategy. As a young exile, Massinissa had sworn allegiance to Rome's rising star, even when his own relatives sided with Carthage. That oath, kept through decades of shifting alliances, earned him a unified kingdom stretching across North Africa. His reward wasn't just land, it was legitimacy. Where other client kings were puppets, Massinissa ruled as a peer because Rome knew his word was iron. The lesson: in a world where everyone expected betrayal, consistency became its own superpower. The Assyrians took oath breaking to chilling extremes. Their vassal treaties included stomach-turning curses. May your children be eaten by dogs, may your lands grow thorns instead of wheat. But these weren't just threats, they were psychological warfare. When King Esarhaddon forced Median chiefs to swear on the severed head of a sacrificed lamb, he wasn't invoking superstition, he was creating living theater. The message was clear: break faith, and this grotesque ritual would haunt your dreams. Surprisingly, it worked. Few dared rebel, not because they feared the gods, but because the spectacle made disloyalty feel like madness. Then there were the oaths that backfired spectacularly. When the Persian King Darius seized power, he cemented it with blood bonds: 7 noble families sworn to mutual loyalty. Yet within generations, those same families would murder his descendants, proving that even the most sacred vows rusted over time. The Byzantines tried a different tack: written contracts witnessed by church patriarchs. But when Emperor Alexios Komnenos needed to break a treaty with the Crusaders, he simply had the patriarch declare it divinely void. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was realism. Rulers understood that oaths were tools, not chains meant to be bent when survival demanded it. the most fascinating promises were the unwritten ones. When Alexander the Great spared the family of his defeated enemy Darius III, it wasn't just mercy, it was a silent bargain. By treating Persian royalty with respect, he convinced their nobles to switch sides peacefully. Contrast this with Rome's sack of Corinth, where they leveled the city despite earlier assurances of leniency. The result: Greek states learned never to trust Roman guarantees, forcing decades of costly rebellions. Alexander's ghost diplomacy outmaneuvered Rome's brute force centuries later, showing that sometimes the most binding contracts were those never put into words. What made these ancient promises so potent and so fragile was their entanglement with identity. A king's honor wasn't just personal, it was the foundation of his rule. When Celtic chieftains swore on their sacred talks or Mongol khans drank mare's milk from shared cups, they weren't just making deals, they were staking their very selves. That's why betrayals cut so deep. They didn't just break agreements, they unmasked the lie at the heart of power. In the end, Antiquity's greatest lesson might be this: trust was the ultimate currency, and the rulers who spent it wisely didn't just survive, they built legacies that outlasted their swords. Tribute wasn't just gold or grain handed over to a stronger neighbor. It was theater, a carefully staged performance where both sides pretended the weaker partner still had dignity. The Athenian-Delian League started as a noble promise, Greek city-states pooling funds to protect against Persian aggression. But within years, the treasury moved from Delos to Athens, and contributions became mandatory payments. What began as voluntary alliance fees morphed into imperial taxation, with Athenian warships showing up to collect what diplomacy couldn't gently extract. The genius of this system: it let Athens dominate without outright conquest. Why waste soldiers occupying a city when you could just demand its silver and let it govern itself until it stepped out of line? When Naxos tried to leave the League, Athens didn't negotiate. It burned their fields and dismantled their walls, turning a reluctant ally into a warning for others. Yet some rulers saw tribute as a bargain. The Khmer Empire demanded exotic gifts from vassals, not because they needed peacock feathers or rare spices, but because the act of submission reinforced hierarchy without bloodshed. Similarly, the Aztec Triple Alliance didn't conquer every neighboring city. Many remained semi-independent, so long as they sent feathers, jade, and captives for sacrifice. This wasn't just economics, it was psychological control. A king who knelt annually to present tribute internalized his inferiority, making rebellion unthinkable. The Mongols perfected tribute into a science. Conquered lands could keep their rulers, customs, even religions if they paid dearly and on time. Miss a payment, and the next visitors weren't tax collectors but tumens of horse archers. Yet this system had unexpected benefits. The Pax Mongolica created safer trade routes from Europe to China than existed for centuries afterward. For merchants and peasants, stability was worth the price, proving that effective tribute could buy more than obedience, it could buy prosperity. Not all submissions were peaceful. When Rome reduced Carthage to a tribute state after the Punic Wars, they didn't just demand money, they dismantled its navy and forbade raising an army without Roman permission. The message was clear: you exist at our pleasure. Yet Carthage's eventual destruction came not from rebellion, but from paying too well. Their rapid economic recovery scared Rome into launching a preemptive war, showing that even flawless compliance could be deadly if it made you look strong. The darkest truth about tribute systems: they often hid conquest in slow motion. The Ottoman devshirme system took Christian boys as tribute, converting them into janissaries, elite soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. Over generations, this drained Balkan communities of their strongest youth while building an army that enforced Muslim rule. Likewise, China's tributary states sent envoys bearing gifts to the Son of Heaven, but the real exchange was recognition. By performing kowtows, they acknowledged Chinese supremacy without a single arrow fired. Yet for some, tribute was survival. Armenian kings sandwiched between Rome and Parthia mastered the art of dual submission, sending gold and hostages to both empires while quietly playing them against each other. The Vikings extracted Danegeld from Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, not because they couldn't take the land, but because predictable extortion was more profitable than unpredictable pillaging. Even the mighty Byzantines paid off Attila the Hun, buying time to fortify their defenses. These uneasy bargains reveal a brutal calculus. Sometimes the cost of defiance outweighed the humiliation of compliance. And in the shadow of that truth, empires grew not just by the sword but by the ledger. The sea was never just water. It was a highway, a battlefield, and the ultimate bargaining chip for empires built on waves. Carthage understood this better than most. Their navy dominated the Mediterranean for centuries, turning the North African coast into an economic powerhouse. But in the treaty ending the First Punic War, Rome demanded something more valuable than gold. Carthage's warships, 300 vessels, were handed over, their oars broken, their hulls burned. This wasn't just disarmament, it was surgical removal of Carthage's ability to project power. Without those ships, Carthage couldn't protect its trade routes, leaving its economy exposed like an open wound. The lesson was brutal but clear. In maritime empires, control of the waves meant control of destiny. The Vikings took naval supremacy to terrifying extremes. Their longships weren't just transport, they were floating fortresses that could navigate shallow rivers and open oceans alike. When the Frankish king Charles the Simple offered Rollo land in exchange for peace, it wasn't generosity, it was desperation. Normandy wasn't given to the Vikings, it was purchased with the promise that they'd stop sailing up the Seine to burn Paris. The brilliance of this deal. It turned pirates into landlords. Rollo's descendants, like William the Conqueror, would use those very shipbuilding skills to cross the Channel and seize England, proving that sometimes the best way to neutralize a naval threat was to give it a home. Venice's rise was built on a more subtle kind of maritime mastery. Their galley monopoly didn't rely on brute force but on logistics. By requiring all merchant ships to sail in state-organized convoys, they turned commerce into a weapon. Need to punish a rebellious colony, delay its galley schedule and watch its economy suffocate. Want to dominate the spice trade, assign the fastest galleys to your preferred routes. Even their famed Arsenal shipyard wasn't just a factory, it was a psychological deterrent. The ability to produce a fully armed galley in a single day sent a message: Venice could outbuild any rival. Yet naval power wasn't always about size or speed. The Hanseatic League, a network of Germanic trading cities, controlled the Baltic not with warships but with contracts. Their coggers, sturdy, broad-beamed cargo ships, were so essential to Northern Europe's grain supply that kings granted the League extraterritorial rights in foreign ports. When the Danish king tried to tax their ships too heavily, the League simply embargoed Denmark until its economy collapsed. No cannons were fired, no harbors were blockaded. The mere threat of withheld ships brought a kingdom to its knees. The most tragic naval bargain might be Spain's Armada. Philip II didn't just build ships, he mortgaged his empire to do so, squeezing silver from the Americas to fund what became a floating catastrophe. The irony: England's smaller, nimbler vessels won not by outgunning the Spanish but by outmaneuvering them. The defeat exposed a hard truth: even the mightiest fleet was useless if it couldn't adapt. These stories reveal that naval power was never just about wooden hulls and canvas sails. It was about flexibility, logistics, and the quiet understanding that whoever controlled the sea lanes didn't just move goods, they shaped fates. From the Phoenicians to the Portuguese, the rulers who mastered this didn't just build ships, they built systems where every wave rolled in their favor. A sack of grain could topple a throne faster than any assassin's blade. The Roman annona system wasn't just a welfare program, it was a calculated survival strategy, where free bread distributed to citizens became the glue holding the empire together. Every morning, thousands lined up at state-run bakeries not out of gratitude but expectation. The moment wheat shipments from Egypt or Sicily faltered, the streets of Rome turned volatile. Emperors knew this intimately. When Caligula allegedly joked about making the people eat cake during a shortage, he learned the hard way that hunger has no sense of humor. His eventual assassination proved that in Rome, the path to power wasn't just paved with gold, it was lined with loaves. Egypt's pharaohs wielded grain as both sword and shield. The Nile's predictable floods made their fields the Mediterranean's most reliable breadbasket, but they didn't just hoard this advantage, they weaponized it. During times of peace, Egyptian grain fed Rome's legions, ensuring loyalty. When diplomacy soured, a single withheld harvest could send shockwaves across empires. Ptolemy VIII once starved rebellious Alexandria into submission by blocking grain shipments, turning the city's own harbor into a trap. The lesson was clear. In Antiquity, food wasn't sustenance, it was leverage. Yet the darkest trades happened during famine. When the Hittite Empire faced drought around 1200 BC, they didn't just beg neighbors for help, they traded entire cities to Egypt for shiploads of grain. Cuneiform tablets reveal their desperation. Our land is dying, our children starving. Send us food and name your price. What makes this chilling isn't the exchange itself, but its aftermath. The Hittites never fully recovered, their weakened state leaving them vulnerable to invasions that erased their kingdom from history. A civilization that once rivaled Egypt vanished not by sword, but by the slow unraveling of empty stomachs. China's emperors took a more systematic approach. Their ever-normal granaries, stockpiles of rice maintained across the empire, were less about charity than stability. By releasing reserves during lean years, they prevented price spikes that could spark revolts. But this system had a sinister edge. Regions that rebelled found their granaries mysteriously empty, forcing them back into line. The Tang dynasty even used controlled famines to break the power of wealthy landowners, proving that hunger could be as precise a tool as any tax policy. The medieval world saw even crueler calculations. During the siege of Jerusalem in 1099, Crusaders didn't just blockade the city, they burned surrounding crops, knowing starvation would do their work for them. When the city fell, survivors reported trading gold for single loaves, only to vomit them up from weeks of malnutrition. Conversely, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan employed a brutal generosity. Cities that surrendered without resistance were spared and fed, while those that fought faced systematic starvation. This wasn't mercy, it was psychological warfare, teaching entire regions that submission meant survival. Perhaps the most revealing cases come from failed strategies. France's Louis XIV thought he could pressure the Dutch Republic by banning grain exports to them in 1672. Instead, Dutch merchants simply bought Polish wheat at higher prices, while French farmers, deprived of their best market, revolted over crashing profits. The Sun King's miscalculation exposed a fundamental truth. Food politics was a double-edged sword that could cut the hand that wielded it. These stories force us to confront an uncomfortable pattern. From Roman bread dole to modern subsidies, the rulers who forget that feeding people isn't just economics, it's the raw calculus of power, rarely keep their crowns for long. Because when the choice is between bread and blood, history shows which one the hungry will inevitably choose. A whisper in the right ear could save an empire or doom it. The Persian king's eyes and ears weren't just poetic titles. They were a meticulously organized spy network stretching from the Nile to the Indus. These royal agents posed as merchants, diplomats, even slaves, reporting everything from grain shortages to rebellious murmurs. But their real power lay in what they traded, not just information, but the illusion of omniscience. By letting subjects believe no conspiracy could escape the king's notice, they prevented rebellions before they began. The system worked so well that when Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he kept it intact, simply replacing Persian spies with his own. The lesson was clear. In the Game of Thrones, knowledge wasn't just power, it was intimidation. Rome elevated espionage into bureaucracy. The frumentarii, originally tasked with procuring grain for the army, morphed into imperial enforcers who used their travel permits to surveil the empire. They didn't just gather intelligence, they manipulated it. A frumentarius could spread rumors of an approaching barbarian horde to justify higher taxes, or lose sensitive scrolls to frame political rivals. Their most sinister innovation, the libellus, a system where citizens could anonymously denounce neighbors for treason, a tool that turned every Roman into a potential informant. The genius of this system wasn't its brutality, but its efficiency. Why waste soldiers policing a province when fear could do the job for free? Not all spy trades were so cynical. Byzantine emperors maintained a shadowy office called the crypteia, where foreign diplomats were lavishly entertained while their servants were bribed or blackmailed into revealing their master's secrets. Yet sometimes the best intelligence came from unexpected sources. During the siege of Tyre, Alexander the Great intercepted letters from the Persian queen mother to her besieged allies. Rather than confiscating them, he allowed the messages through, after altering them to include false assurances of imminent relief. The defenders, buoyed by hope, held out longer, wasting precious supplies. Alexander's brilliance lay in understanding that the most valuable lies weren't those you kept, but those you let your enemies believe. The Tang dynasty's spy networks operated on a different axis, commerce. Chinese merchants traveling the Silk Road weren't just selling silk, they were human cartographers, memorizing tribal allegiances and garrison strengths. The imperial court even established guest houses along trade routes where foreign envoys were plied with wine while their luggage was searched. But the most ingenious tool was the Knight Shining White, a breed of fast horses used exclusively for couriers. These steeds could outrun any bandit, ensuring messages arrived unaltered. When the Tibetan Empire captured some of these horses, it wasn't just a theft, it was an espionage coup that leveled the playing field. Yet for all their sophistication, ancient spy networks had one fatal weakness: the human factor. The pharaoh's eyes of the king in Canaan were undone not by enemy agents, but by their own greed accepting bribes to falsify reports. Similarly, Rome's Praetorian Guard, originally tasked with protecting the emperor, became notorious for selling assassination plots to the highest bidder. The Sassanid Empire's postmaster spies, who monitored all road traffic, were so feared that merchants began using carrier pigeons instead, inadvertently inventing a new form of secure communication. These shadow games reveal a paradox. The very systems designed to ensure stability often sowed chaos. A spy's loyalty was only as strong as their last payment, and the secrets they sold could backfire spectacularly. When the Byzantine general Belisarius intercepted a Gothic king's letter during the siege of Rome, its contents' pleas for reinforcements should have been cause for alarm. Instead, Belisarius forged a reply instructing the Goths to attack at dawn, then leaked it to his own troops. The resulting ambush didn't just win a battle. It proved that in the economy of secrets, sometimes the most valuable currency was the truth disguised as a lie. The line between myth and reality was often razor-thin in antiquity, where legendary objects carried weight far beyond their physical form. Take the Holy Grail, more than just a sacred cup from Christian lore. It became a geopolitical bargaining chip during the Middle Ages. European monarchs from Charlemagne to Edward III claimed blood ties to Joseph of Arimathea, the Grail's mythical guardian, using this connection to justify their divine right to rule. The Grail's power lay not in its existence but in its absence. Because no one could produce it, every king could claim to be its rightful seeker. Crusader kings especially leaned into this symbolism, framing their Middle Eastern campaigns not just as land grabs but as holy quests to recover the ultimate relic. Templar knights allegedly died protecting Grail secrets, while rival nobles bankrupted themselves financing fruitless searches. The brilliance of this myth was its flexibility. It could inspire loyalty, fund wars, or discredit rivals, all without a single shred of evidence. Excalibur played a similar role in British sovereignty struggles. When Welsh princes resisted Norman rule, they didn't just raise armies, they circulated prophecies that Arthur's sword would return in their hour of need. These weren't fairy tales, they were psychological warfare. King Edward I understood this all too well. After conquering Wales, he staged a grand ceremony at Caernarfon Castle to present his son as the new Arthur, even displaying what he claimed was the original Excalibur. The sword was almost certainly a replica, but its symbolic value was undeniable. By co-opting the legend, Edward didn't just claim territory, he rewrote mythology itself to serve his dynasty. The Ring of Gyges from Plato's Republic reveals another facet of this phenomenon. Though fictional, its premise, a ring granting invisibility and thus unchecked power, mirrored real ancient debates about authorities' corrupting influence. Persian kings reportedly wore signet rings engraved with warnings like, "This too shall pass," not as jewelry but as political theater. The message to observers was clear: our power is absolute, but even we acknowledge its fleeting nature. Hellenistic rulers later adapted this trope, commissioning gemstones carved with their portraits that doubled as seals. A single wax impression from such a ring could mobilize armies or empty treasuries, making these small objects more potent than battle standards. Perhaps the most fascinating intersection of myth and reality occurred with the Palladium of Troy. This ancient statue of Athena was said to protect whichever city housed it. When Roman generals claimed to have stolen it during their conquest of Greece, they weren't just looting, they were performing spiritual asset stripping. By transferring the Palladium to Rome, they symbolically transferred Troy's divine protection to themselves, legitimizing their empire as Troy's heir. Never mind that multiple cities claimed to possess the real Palladium. The belief itself was enough to sway public opinion. These legendary objects shared a common thread. They transformed abstract power into tangible symbols that could be fought over, traded, or stolen. A king who possessed Arthur's sword wasn't just a ruler, he was destiny's chosen. A city that housed the Grail wasn't just a place, it was a pilgrimage site commanding global influence. And in a world where perception often trumped reality, the cleverest leaders knew that sometimes the most valuable treasures were the ones that never existed at all. A captured soldier in antiquity was more than a prisoner, they were a living ledger of their kingdom's worth, their fate balancing between ransom and chains. After the Battle of Cannae, where Hannibal's forces annihilated Rome's legions, the Carthaginian general faced a pivotal choice: demand gold for the 8,000 surviving prisoners or make a statement. His decision to refuse ransom outright wasn't just cruelty, it was psychological warfare. By selling some into slavery and leaving others to rot, he sent Rome a message: their soldiers were disposable. But the move backfired catastrophically. Instead of breaking Roman morale, it forged a resolve so fierce that mothers famously told their sons to return victorious or dead, but never captured. The very act meant to demoralize became the spark that fueled Rome's merciless march to Carthage's eventual destruction. Not all cultures treated prisoners as pawns. The Mongols saw captured warriors as potential recruits, offering them a stark choice: swear allegiance to Genghis Khan or face annihilation. Many chose the former, swelling Mongol ranks with experienced fighters who'd once been enemies. This wasn't mercy, it was pragmatism. A skilled archer was worth more alive, even if his loyalty had to be bought with shared spoils and the threat of overwhelming force. Conversely, the Aztecs viewed war captives as sacred currency, their sacrifices atop temples believed to sustain the cosmos. To refuse a ransom demand wasn't just a military tactic, it was a theological necessity, ensuring the sun would rise another day. The Byzantine Empire took a more bureaucratic approach. Their POW camps doubled as intelligence hubs, where captured officers were accidentally allowed to overhear false troop movements or see forged maps. When released in prisoner exchanges, these men unwittingly carried back misinformation that could alter entire campaigns. One surviving account describes a Sassanid Persian general who, after being ransomed, led his army into a Byzantine trap because his captors had subtly convinced him the mountain pass was undefended. Yet the most revealing trades were those that never happened. During the Crusades, Saladin's decision to release thousands of Christian prisoners without ransom after capturing Jerusalem wasn't just chivalry, it was strategic branding. By positioning himself as magnanimous, he eroded the moral authority of Crusader leaders who demanded exorbitant sums for Muslim captives. His generosity cost him short-term wealth but won long-term leverage, turning European public opinion against further campaigns. The value of a prisoner fluctuated like stock in ancient markets. Celtic chieftains prized highborn captives for the prestige of their ransom, while the Inca valued physical strength, turning POWs into laborers for their terraced farms. Sparta's infamous rejection of Athenians' silver offers for their captured soldiers during the Peloponnesian War wasn't about principle. It was a chilling calculation that dead enemies couldn't regroup. These exchanges expose a brutal truth. In Antiquity, the treatment of prisoners was never just about the captives themselves. It was a mirror reflecting what societies valued most, whether gold, gods, or the grim arithmetic of war. And as Rome proved after Cannae, sometimes the deepest wounds weren't inflicted by swords, but by the refusal to negotiate at all. Alexander's greatest conquest wasn't territory, it was taste. When his armies marched from Greece to India, they didn't just bring spears and siege engines, they carried an entire cultural operating system. Greek became the lingua franca from Egypt to Afghanistan, not because locals were forced to speak it, but because it was the language of trade, philosophy, and status. In the markets of Babylon, a merchant who could quote Homer might secure better deals. At the courts of Bactria, rulers minted coins with their own faces but stamped in Greek artistic style, complete with Apollo's profile. This wasn't coercion, it was aspiration. The Hellenistic world thrived because it made assimilation feel like upward mobility, turning Macedonian sandals and Ionic columns into ancient status symbols as coveted as today's luxury brands. Buddhism's journey along the Silk Road reveals a subtler kind of conquest. When the Kushan Emperor Kanishka embraced the faith in the 1st century AD, he didn't send missionaries, he funded artists. The Gandhara school's sculptures fused Greek realism with Buddhist spirituality, creating the first ever depictions of the Buddha in human form. These weren't just artworks, they were marketing tools. A nomadic trader seeing a Greco-Buddha statue in Samarkand might not understand sutras, but he'd recognize the craftsmanship as something valuable, sparking curiosity. By the time Buddhism reached China, it had absorbed local flavors, two Taoist concepts blended with nirvana, turning a foreign philosophy into something familiarly Chinese. The genius of this cultural trade, it moved not through force but through aesthetic seduction. Language often served as the ultimate soft power currency. The Roman elite's obsession with Greek tutors wasn't just academic pretension, it was a class marker. A senator's son rattling off Euripides in Athens proved his family's cosmopolitan reach, much like Victorian Britain's flaunted French phrases. Meanwhile, in medieval Spain, the Toledo School of Translators became a cultural exchange hub where Jewish, Muslim, and Christian scholars worked side by side rendering Arabic texts into Latin. This wasn't just knowledge transfer, it was a silent rebuke to the Crusades' violence, proving ideas could cross religious lines even when armies couldn't. The most unexpected cultural trades happened through cuisine. When the Mongols conquered Persia, they didn't impose their diet of fermented mare's milk, they adopted Persian stews and pilafs, eventually exporting this blended culinary tradition to India as Mughlai cuisine. Similarly, the humble noodle traveled from China to Italy not through conquest but via Venetian merchants who encountered it in Mongol-ruled Crimea. These gastronomic exchanges remind us that cultural influence often moves through stomachs before it reaches minds. Artistic styles became diplomatic tools in the hands of clever rulers. When Charlemagne imported Byzantine Marsacists to Aachen, he wasn't just decorating a chapel, he was claiming equality with Constantinople's emperors. Centuries later, the Ottoman sultans commissioned portraits from Italian Renaissance painters, not because they'd abandoned Islamic art, but to project a hybrid identity that resonated with European powers. Even the Aztecs practiced this delicate dance. Their featherwork sculptures impressed Spanish conquistadors so deeply that Cortés sent several to Charles V as proof of Mesoamerica's sophistication. The darkest cultural trades were those of erasure. Roman victors didn't just loot Celtic sacred sites, they rebuilt them as Roman temples, layering Jupiter's name over local deities in a spiritual rebranding. The Spanish Inquisition forced converted Jews to eat pork in public, turning meals into loyalty tests. Yet resistance often bubbled beneath the surface, Irish monks preserving Latin texts while adding Gaelic marginalia, or Andean weavers encoding rebellion in traditional patterns that Spanish overlords couldn't decipher. These exchanges reveal a paradox. The cultures that proved most resilient weren't those that rejected outside influence, but those that mastered the art of selective absorption. Just as the Swahili coast blended Bantu, Arabic, and Persian into a vibrant new identity, or Japan remade borrowed Chinese characters into kanji, the most enduring kingdoms understood that cultural power wasn't about purity. It was about making the foreign feel inevitable. Dynastic mergers were the ultimate high-stakes gamble of antiquity, where two royal bloodlines entwined like serpents on a scepter, promising unity but often delivering chaos. The Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt perfected this delicate dance, keeping power within the family through generations of sibling marriages that would make modern geneticists wince. Cleopatra VII, the last and most famous of her line, wasn't just married to her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, she ruled alongside him until their rivalry erupted into civil war. Yet what seems grotesque today was shrewd strategy then. By keeping the bloodline pure, the Ptolemies prevented foreign nobles from claiming the throne through marriage. preserving their Greek Macedonian identity while ruling over native Egyptians. The irony, their incestuous stability came at a cost. By the time Cleopatra faced Rome, her dynasty was so isolated by its own insularity that it had no local allies left to call upon. Half a world away, the Borgias demonstrated how dynastic ambition could shred an entire region. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, he didn't just want spiritual authority. He envisioned a Borgia kingdom stretching across Italy. His daughter Lucrezia's marriages were less unions than chess moves, each annulment and remarriage advancing the family's territorial claims. Cesare Borgia, her brother, leveraged these ties to carve out a personal duchy in Romagna, using his sister's nuptials as diplomatic cover for military conquest. But where the Ptolemies' intermarriage bred stability, the Borgias' machinations bred paranoia. Their relentless scheming united rival families against them, turning Italy into a powder keg that ultimately consumed their ambitions. The lesson was clear: dynastic mergers could build empires, but only if the rest of the nobility agreed to play along. The Habsburgs took a different approach, turning marriage into a continental-scale merger and acquisition strategy. Their motto, "Let others wage war, you happy Austria marry," wasn't just a quip, it was a business model. When Maximilian I wed Mary of Burgundy, he didn't just gain a wife, he absorbed the wealthy Low Countries into Habsburg control. Their grandson Charles V inherited not just Spain through his mother Joanna, but the Holy Roman Empire through his grandfather's lineage, creating a realm where the sun never set. Yet this sprawling inheritance came with hidden costs. Charles's son Philip II, born of cousin marriage, inherited not just lands but also the infamous Habsburg jaw and a genetic predisposition to melancholy. By the time Charles II, the product of generations of uncle-niece unions, ascended Spain's throne, he couldn't choose solid food or produce an heir, dooming his branch of the dynasty. The Habsburgs proved that while strategic marriages could build an empire, they could also genetically bankrupt it. Not all dynastic unions ended in tragedy or triumph, some simply fizzled. When Henry VIII of England married Catherine of Aragon, the union of Tudor and Trastamara bloodlines promised a golden alliance between England and Spain. But when Catherine failed to bear a surviving son, Henry's desperation for a male heir led him to break with Rome, triggering the English Reformation. What began as a merger of equals became a cautionary tale about pinning dynastic survival on something as fragile as fertility. Similarly, the Valois kings of France repeatedly intermarried with the Medici of Florence, hoping to inject banking wealth into royal coffers. Instead, they got Catherine de' Medici, a queen whose political acumen was overshadowed by the disastrous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, proving that imported dynasties could bring unintended consequences. The most fascinating mergers were those that transcended mere politics. When the Khitan-Lyro dynasty of northern China married their princesses to Korean kings, they weren't just securing peace, they were creating cultural bridges. These peace bride marriages introduced Khitan customs, dress, and even Buddhism into Korea's royal court, leaving legacies that outlasted the dynasties themselves. Centuries later, the Mughal Emperor Akbar married a Rajput princess, not just to secure an alliance, but to blend Islamic and Hindu traditions into a new syncretic culture. Their son Jahangir would embody this fusion, commissioning art that celebrated both faiths and ruling over a golden age of tolerance. These stories reveal that dynastic mergers were never just about bloodlines or territory, they were about narrative control. A royal marriage could rewrite history, turning conquerors into legitimate heirs or forging new identities from old rivalries. Whether through the Ptolemaics' calculated incest or the Borgias' ruthless deal-making, These unions remind us that in the ancient world, the most binding contracts weren't signed in ink. They were sealed in vows, conceived in bedchambers, and often paid for in blood. Offering sanctuary to a fallen ruler was like sheltering a live coal. It might warm your halls or burn them down. Thebes learned this the hard way when they welcomed exiled Spartan kings in the 4th century BC. These weren't charity cases, they were coiled springs of ambition. The Spartans bided their time, studying Theban politics and forging alliances, until the moment came to reclaim their throne, with Theban blood staining their path home. The city that had sheltered them soon faced Spartan armies at the Battle of Leuctra, where innovative Theban tactics crushed Sparta's once invincible phalanx. The irony was brutal. The very exiles Thebes had nurtured returned to break Spartan power forever, proving that no act of asylum came without strings attached. Rome played the exile game with chilling precision. When the Seleucid king Antiochus IV fled to Rome after losing his throne, the Senate didn't just offer refuge, they groomed him. For over a decade, he lived as a guest, absorbing Roman military strategies and political customs. When they finally backed his return to Syria, he wasn't just a restored monarch, he was a Roman proxy, importing gladiatorial games and Latin administrative practices to the Hellenistic East. This wasn't hospitality, it was imperialism by other means, turning exile into an incubation period for cultural conquest. The Mongol Empire weaponized exile on an industrial scale. Conquered rulers weren't just killed, they were relocated to Karakorum, Genghis Khan's capital, where they served as living trophies. The Jin dynasty's emperors spent their days as honored prisoners in felt tents, their presence a constant reminder of Mongol dominance. Yet some exiles turned the tables. King David of Georgia, after years in Mongol custody, returned home with something more valuable than freedom: intimate knowledge of Mongol tactics. His reformed army would later inflict one of the few defeats the Mongols ever suffered, showing that captivity could be the ultimate espionage training. Medieval Europe's courts swirled with exiled royalty, each a potential chess piece in larger games. When England's Henry IV deposed Richard II, he imprisoned rather than killed him, but the mere rumor of Richard's survival sparked rebellions for years. Meanwhile, the Scottish King David II, captured by the English, became a bargaining chip so valuable that his 11-year captivity included a luxurious court in exile, complete with Scottish nobles paying homage to him in enemy territory. These weren't just prisoners, they were shadow kings whose influence lingered like smoke long after their thrones were lost. The most cunning exiles turned their banishment into branding. Napoleon's first exile to Elba in 1814 should have been political death, yet he transformed the tiny island into a miniature empire, complete with a navy and court rituals. When he escaped, the sheer audacity of his return made France abandon the Bourbons overnight. Similarly, the Zulu king Cetshwayo, exiled to Cape Town by the British, used his captivity to master English and study colonial law. His petitions and interviews turned him into an international cause célèbre, forcing the British to restore him, albeit to a fractured kingdom. These stories reveal a paradox. Exile could be both gilded cage and finishing school for kings. The rulers who thrived in captivity understood that sanctuary wasn't just about survival. It was an opportunity to observe, adapt, and sometimes to plot the ultimate comeback tour where the opening act was vengeance. Mercenaries were the ultimate wild cards of ancient warfare fighters who owed allegiance not to crowns or causes, but to the heaviest purse. Carthage built an empire on their backs, hiring Iberian slingers, Balearic skirmishers, and Libyan infantry to wage their wars. But when the First Punic War drained Carthage's treasury, these hired blades turned on their employers with terrifying speed. The mercenary war that followed wasn't just a revolt, it was a masterclass in the dangers of purchased loyalty. Thousands of battle-hardened troops, unpaid and furious, laid siege to Carthage itself, crucifying their former commanders and nearly toppling the city. The conflict grew so brutal that even Rome, Carthage's eternal rival, sent grain shipments to help suppress it, not out of sympathy, but fear that the chaos might spread. Carthage survived, but the lesson was etched in blood. An army that fights for gold might just kill you for it. Yet the Byzantine Varangian Guard proved mercenaries could become something far more than hired swords. These Norse warriors, recruited from Scandinavia and Kievan Rus, started as elite bodyguards for emperors, but over centuries they evolved into a brotherhood bound by something deeper than coin. Their legendary loyalty wasn't bought, it was earned through shared rituals, land grants, and the sacred duty of protecting Constantinople's sacred relics. When Emperor Basil II gifted them the right to loot the imperial treasury after his death, it wasn't a paycheck, it was a testament to trust. Varangians didn't just defend emperors, they became kingmakers, deciding fates in palace coups with their trademark double-headed axes, the secret to their fidelity. Byzantium treated them not as disposable tools, but as pillars of the empire's identity. The condottieri of Renaissance Italy showed how mercenary relationships could twist into something even more complex. These professional captains didn't just rent out their armies, they played city-states against each other like chess masters. Sir John Hawkwood, an English mercenary, became so indispensable to Florence that they paid him not to fight against them, even when he was technically employed by rivals. His allegiances shifted with the seasons, yet cities kept hiring him because his skill outweighed the risk. The condottieri system collapsed only when outside powers like France invaded, proving that mercenary armies worked splendidly until someone introduced actual stakes. Switzerland's medieval pikemen turned mercenary service into a national export so reliable it became a de facto foreign policy. Entire Swiss cantons organized around leasing regiments to European monarchs, with contracts so ironclad they'd fight against their own countrymen if paid to do so. Their reputation for unwavering professionalism, they'd retreat only when their contract expired, regardless of battlefield conditions, made them the gold standard of hired troops. France's kings relied on Swiss guards so completely that they became the last defenders of the Tuileries during the French Revolution, dying to a man rather than break their oath. Here, mercenary loyalty wasn't just transactional, it was woven into national honor. The Mamluks took this paradox further, starting as slave soldiers and ending as sultans. Purchased as boys from Eurasian steppes, they were trained in warfare and Islam, forming a warrior caste with no ties except to each other. Their loyalty to their patrons lasted only as long as those patrons remained strongest. When the Ayyubid dynasty grew weak, the Mamluks didn't just revolt, they established their own empire that outshone their former masters. This wasn't betrayal, it was the inevitable result of building power structures where military might belong to those with no stake in the status quo. These contrasting examples beg the central question: can allegiance ever truly be bought? The answer lies in understanding what mercenaries really trade. It's never just about money, it's about identity, stability, and sometimes the chance to rewrite their own stories. The Varangians became Byzantines in all but blood. The Swiss turned service into national myth. Even Carthage's doomed mercenaries weren't inherently disloyal. They rebelled when promises broke, not pay. The rulers who succeeded with hired armies understood this truth. Mercenaries don't sell their loyalty, they rent it, and the lease terms must be renewed daily through respect, reward, and the unspoken understanding that today's employer could be tomorrow's comrade or corpse. Sacred sites weren't just places of worship, they were choke points in the spiritual geography of power. where faith and territory collided with world-shaking consequences. Consider Jerusalem, a city so coveted that its mere name could launch centuries of holy wars. When Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he didn't just offer salvation. He weaponized pilgrimage, turning what had been individual acts of devotion into a coordinated campaign of conquest. The knights who stormed Jerusalem's walls in 1099 weren't merely soldiers, they were armed pilgrims, believing that controlling the city where Christ walked would grant them divine favor on earth. But the real prize wasn't the Church of the Holy Sepulchre's stones. It was the allegiance of every Christian who dreamed of kneeling there. Crusader kings quickly learned that holding Jerusalem meant little if the routes to reach it, those fragile threads connecting Europe to the Levant, weren't also under their control. The rise of the Knights Templar, who guarded pilgrim roads with monastic discipline, revealed the cold calculus behind sacred geography. Faith could be funneled, taxed, and militarized like any other resource. Delphi's oracle operated on a different kind of spiritual leverage. Nestled on Mount Parnassus, this smoky cleft in the earth was Antiquity's most influential advice column, where kings and peasants alike sought Apollo's cryptic guidance. But the oracle's true power lay in its neutrality. City-states built lavish treasuries around the site, not just to store offerings, but to advertise their wealth and piety to rivals. When Croesus of Lydia asked whether to attack Persia, the oracle's famous reply, "If you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall," wasn't just prophecy. It was diplomatic judo, phrased to maintain Delphi's reputation no matter the outcome. The priests understood that ambiguity was their currency, and the competing powers who funded their temple were essentially paying to keep the oracle's influence up for grabs. Mecca before Islam tells an even older story of sacred economics. The Kaaba, then a pantheon of tribal idols, drew pilgrims from across Arabia, and the Quraysh tribes' control over its rituals made them the gatekeepers of intertribal truces. When Muhammad returned from exile to cleanse the Kaaba of idols, he wasn't just reforming religion, he was seizing the logistical hub of Arabian trade and diplomacy. The annual Hajj pilgrimage became Islam's unifying engine, but it also served as a stealth infrastructure project, binding scattered desert tribes into a network of maintained wells and protected roads radiating from Mecca. Buddhist rulers mastered this art of spiritual cartography too. The Mauryan Emperor Ashoka didn't just convert to Buddhism, he planted relics across South Asia in elaborate stupas, transforming remote hills into magnets for devotion. These weren't just shrines, they were nodes in a sacred network that mirrored his administrative centers, ensuring that wherever subjects traveled, they encountered symbols of imperial piety. Centuries later, the Sri Lankan kings would one-up this strategy by claiming possession of the Buddha's tooth relic, making their island the indispensable heart of Buddhist legitimacy. The darkest manipulations of sacred geography happened during the Reformation, when rival churches literally remapped holiness. Protestant leaders stripped saints' bones from altars, not just to reject idolatry, but to erase the physical coordinates of Catholic power. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church doubled down on relics, displaying so-called fragments of the true cross and Veronica's veil to prove their monopoly on divine connection. These battles over sacred real estate weren't about theology alone, they were about controlling the venues where humanity met the divine, and by extension, the wealth and loyalty those encounters generated. Perhaps no site illustrates this fusion of faith and strategy better than Santiago de Compostela. What began as the discovery of St. James's bones in 9th century Galicia became Europe's greatest pilgrimage machine, with entire economies sprouting along the Camino trails. French monasteries built bridges to divert pilgrim traffic their way, while Spanish kings used the route to consolidate their reconquest of Muslim territories. The scallop shell symbol worn by pilgrims wasn't just a badge of devotion, it was a passport granting access to a continent-wide system of hostels and protections. Those humble shells remind us that in the ancient world, the road to heaven was always paved with earthly ambitions. Time wasn't just a measurement in ancient kingdoms, it was a weapon, a shield, and sometimes the only currency that mattered. While Rome expanded at the speed of its legions, China's Han Dynasty played a slower, subtler game. Their tributary system didn't just demand gold or goods from vassal states, it demanded ritual submission at carefully spaced intervals. A nomadic chieftain might only have to kneel before the Son of Heaven once every few years, but those ceremonial moments wove a psychological net that conquest never could. The genius lay in the waiting. By allowing peripheral rulers to govern themselves between tributes, China avoided the crushing administrative costs of direct rule. When the Xiongnu nomads rebelled, the Han didn't just send armies, they waited. They knew winter pastures would thin, alliances would fracture, and eventually hunger would drive their enemies back to the negotiation table. This wasn't indecision, it was strategic patience, the understanding that some threats dissolve on their own if given enough time. The Byzantine Empire mastered this art of temporal leverage. After losing Rome's western territories, they didn't waste resources reclaiming them outright. Instead, they cultivated a shadow empire through titles and marriages, recognizing barbarian kings as nominal subjects while focusing on economic dominance. A Lombard duke might rule Italy in practice, but if he bought Byzantine silk, used Byzantine coinage, and sought Byzantine approval for his heir's legitimacy, who truly held power? This diplomatic patience paid off spectacularly when Justinian's generals eventually recaptured Rome, not through sheer force, but because decades of cultural osmosis had softened Italian resistance. The Byzantines understood what impatient conquerors forgot. Influence compounds over time, often making later victories cheaper than early ones. Even war could be waged on a delayed timetable. The Mongols under Genghis Khan didn't always sack cities immediately. Some were offered surrender terms so generous they seemed absurd until years later, when their lightly garrisoned allies found themselves locked into an inescapable system of taxation and conscription. The Venetians employed similar long-game tactics during the Fourth Crusade. Instead of rushing to Jerusalem, they diverted the campaign to conquer Zara and Constantinople, knowing these commercial hubs would fund their ambitions for centuries. Their real weapon wasn't swords, it was shipping contracts and interest rates that unfolded over generations. The darkest applications of patience came from the Spartans. Their Agoj training system took boys at 7 and returned them as soldiers at 30, investing 23 years in each warrior. This glacial pace created fighters so disciplined they could hold Thermopylae against impossible odds, but it also made Sparta brittle. When their population declined, they couldn't quickly replace losses, proof that patience without adaptability could be fatal. Yet the most striking examples emerge from societies that turned waiting into cultural capital. The Dogon people of Mali preserved astronomical knowledge across centuries, passing down precise star maps until modern telescopes confirmed their accuracy. The Maoris of New Zealand held ancestral land claims in oral tradition for generations until legal systems caught up with their memories. These weren't passive acts, they were active resistance through temporal endurance, proving that the most powerful kingdoms weren't always those that moved fastest, but those that outlasted. In the end, these civilizations grasped a truth we often ignore: time favors those who wield it with intention. Whether through China's ceremonial delays, Byzantium's diplomatic gradualism, or the Mongols' deferred conquests, the ancient world's greatest strategists knew that patience wasn't the absence of action. It was action compressed into a longer arc, where the wait itself became the most potent trade of all. History's most consequential trades weren't always sealed with treaties or stamped with royal insignias. Sometimes they happened in hushed corridors behind cupped hands or through a glance across a banquet hall. Consider Cardinal Richelieu's infamous network of spies in 17th century France. While official documents recorded alliances with Protestant states, his true leverage came from the unspoken blackmail dossiers he maintained on rival nobles. A whispered rumor about a duke's gambling debts or a bishop's illegitimate child could bend court politics without a single parchment changing hands. This was power in its purest form, invisible, deniable, and devastatingly effective. The Mongol Empire's rise was fueled by similar shadow bargains. Before battles, Genghis Khan's scouts didn't just gather military intelligence. They identified disgruntled officers in enemy ranks. Through covert messengers, these men received promises of lands or titles if they switched sides mid-conflict. No treaties documented these arrangements. Loyalty was secured through tribal intermediaries whose word carried more weight than any written contract. When entire cavalry units defected during sieges, it wasn't betrayal, it was the culmination of silent negotiations conducted in yurts under the cover of night. Even royal successions hinged on unwritten understandings. The Ottoman Empire's notorious law of fratricide, where new sultans executed their brothers, was never formally codified. Yet every heir knew the rules: win the throne or die. This grim calculus created a shadow economy of concubines bribing palace guards, viziers tipping scales during succession crises, and exiled princes building secret alliances from distant provinces. When Suleiman the Magnificent spared his son Selim's life despite multiple rebellions, it wasn't mercy, it was a silent acknowledgement that Selim's rivals had deeper pockets. The most intriguing unwritten trades involved religion as political theater. During Europe's wars of religion, Catholic and Protestant rulers often maintained clandestine correspondences despite public posturing. Elizabeth I of England and Philip II of Spain traded blistering public condemnations while allowing mutual trade through neutral ports. Their merchants paid taxes to both crowns under false flags, proving that faith could be loudly proclaimed on pulpits and quietly negotiated in ledgers. Then there were the threats too explosive to commit to paper. When the Byzantine Emperor Basil II blinded 15,000 Bulgar prisoners, he didn't issue a decree. He sent the survivors home, their hollow eye sockets serving as a grisly message no treaty could convey. Centuries later, Catherine the Great would employ similar psychological warfare during her expansion into Crimea, using rumors of impending massacres to spur mass surrenders without drawn-out sieges. These weren't just acts of cruelty, they were currencies of terror traded in whispers across enemy lines. The fragility of these shadow agreements made them paradoxically stronger. A vassal who received lands through a secret pact couldn't appeal to courts if betrayed. He could only retaliate in kind, ensuring mutual destruction. This created webs of unspoken mutual interest that often outlasted formal alliances. The Venetian Council of Ten operated on this principle, conducting state business through nods and coded phrases rather than minutes. Their infamous lion's mouth letter slots allowed citizens to anonymously accuse neighbors, turning gossip into governance. Perhaps the greatest testament to unwritten power lies in what historians can't find. The missing correspondence between Cleopatra and Herod the Great, the burned diaries of Spain's Ferdinand and Isabella, the deliberately vague clauses in the Treaty of Westphalia that allowed rulers to interpret religious tolerance as they pleased. These gaps in the record aren't absences of history. They're its dark matter, the invisible forces that shaped kingdoms far more than any crown or charter ever could. Because in the end, the most durable bargains weren't the ones etched in stone, but the ones carved into the collective memory of those who knew better than to speak them aloud. From gold to hostages, from marriages to myths, the ancient world's kingdoms were bought, sold, and traded in ways that still echo today. These deals remind us that power is never just about force, it's about perception, negotiation, and sometimes sheer audacity. Think about the Hittites trading cities for grain, or Cleopatra betting her kingdom on a single alliance. These weren't reckless gambles, they were calculated moves in a high-stakes game where the currency wasn't always coins, but influence, trust, and even deception. The echoes of these ancient trades reverberate in our modern world too. When nations today negotiate trade deals or form alliances, they're playing a version of the same game, just with suits and treaties instead of swords and seals. The Byzantine practice of trading titles for loyalty, you can see its shadow in modern diplomacy, where honorary degrees and state dinners grease the wheels of international relations. And those whispered secrets exchanged in royal courts, they've evolved into back-channel negotiations and cyber espionage, proving that while the tools have changed, the strategies remain eerily familiar. But here's the twist. The most enduring lesson from these ancient bargains isn't about strategy, it's about adaptability. The kingdoms that thrived weren't always the richest or the strongest, but the ones that understood the fluid nature of value. A relic, a hostage, a strip of land, each was only as powerful as the context allowed. The rulers who survived were the ones who could pivot when gold lost its luster or when a sworn ally turned foe. In that sense, Antiquity's greatest traders were also its greatest illusionists, turning perception into power and scarcity into supremacy. So as we step back from this journey through history's most astonishing deals, ask yourself, what would you trade for a kingdom? Would you gamble on a marriage alliance or hoard knowledge like the Phoenicians? Would you bet on loyalty like the Numidian kings or on fear like the Assyrians? The choices these rulers faced weren't just about their time. They're mirrors of the trade-offs we still make today, whether in politics, business, or even our personal lives. If this deep dive into the art of the ancient deal has sparked your curiosity, let's keep the conversation going. Drop a comment below with your take. Would you have traded a city for survival or held out for a better offer? And don't forget to subscribe, because history's vault is still full of untold stories waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, remember, the past isn't just a collection of dates and battles. It's a masterclass in the timeless dance of power, persuasion, and the price of ambition.